Great. So this webinar was created because many providers in the HIV field are serving diverse populations of people across racial, ethnic, religious, gender, sexuality, and cultural contexts. Despite progress in overall population health, disparities still exist. These disparities adversely impact the health of minority populations and contribute to many health incidences. Experts recognize the need to enhance services for cultural and linguistic diverse populations. Providing culturally and linguistically appropriate services requires an understanding of cultural competence. For this webinar, we are using the following definition of cultural competence. Cultural and linguistic competence is a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals that enables effective work in cross-cultural situations. This is adopted from the research of Cross. This webinar is designed to provide quick and short tips for providers directly and indirectly funded by the CDC. The aim is to guide you, the providers, in creating and implementing culturally appropriate services to diverse populations. Moreover, the webinar will elicit areas of needs to yield CBA requests such as cultural competency, cultural humility, and other organizational development and management trainings. The objectives of this webinar are to explore the stages of the cultural competency continuum and discuss tips to integrate and implement cultural competency strategies within your programming and agency that meet the needs of the communities that you serve. Furthermore, we will conclude with elements linked to the achievement of cultural proficiency. The definition of culture refers to integrated patterns of human behavior that include the language, thoughts, communications, actions, customs, beliefs, values, and institutions of racial, ethnic, religious, or social groups. The definition of competence implies having a capacity to function effectively as an individual and an organization within the context of cultural beliefs, behaviors, and needs presented by consumers and their communities. Therefore, cultural competency is a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals that enables effective work in cross-cultural situations. Now let's have a look at the cultural competency continuum. Cultural competence is a complex framework, and there is a tendency for systems and organizations to want a textbook solution, a quick fix, a recipe, or a how-to, step-by-step approach to being competent with regards to specific cultures. The complexity of achieving cultural competence does not allow for such an easy solution. The Cross framework emphasizes that the process of achieving cultural competency occurs along a continuum and sets forth 6 stages, including cultural destructiveness, cultural incapacity, cultural blindness, cultural pre-competence, cultural competence, and cultural proficiency. It is helpful for systems and organizations to conduct a self-assessment and use the results to set goals and plan for meaningful growth. The National Center for Cultural Competence developed the following system of organizational characteristics that may be exhibited at various stages of the cultural competence continuum. The characteristics delineated in this continuum are not meant to define a system or an organization. Rather, they allow systems and organizations to broadly gauge where they are and plan for positive movement and growth to achieve cultural competence and cultural proficiency. The continuum is dynamic and not intended to be viewed as a linear manner. Systems and organizations may be at different stages, at different times, with different priority populations and cultural groups. Finally, system and organizational competency is not limited to the arrival at cultural competence or proficiency, as there is always room for continued growth. So let's jump in and take a look at the first point here, which is cultural destructiveness. Cultural destructiveness is characterized by attitudes, policies, and structures and practices within a system or organization that are destructive to a cultural group. This stage on the continuum acknowledges only one way of being and purposefully denies any other cultural approach. It is also the most negative end of the continuum, represented by attitudes, policies, and practices that are destructive to cultures and consequently the individuals within those cultures. So it's defined, as you can see, it's defined as attitudes, policies, and structures and practices within a system or an organization that are destructive to a cultural group. And the example of how this can be seen within society is ethnic cleansing. Historically, some agencies have been actively involved in services that have denied people of color access to their natural helpers and healers, removed children of color from their families based on race, or purposely risked the well-being of minority individuals in social or medical experiments without their knowledge or consent. What are some other examples of cultural destructiveness that you can think of? So you can either push *7 to unmute yourself and share another example that you have, or you can write it in the chat box. So we have some examples that are coming in through the chat function. And so one example that we were given by a participant is racial profiling. And I think that definitely speaks directly to the definition. It's talking about a specific policy or practice that is done by police officers that is very destructive to a specific cultural group. Some other examples along those lines would be the war on drugs. That was a very specific policy that was enacted that was very destructive to certain cultural groups as well. And also another one that just came in is the non-consensual sterilization of women. Again, we know that was a practice that was done historically, and it was done in a specific cultural group, right? So I think y'all understand destructiveness. So let's move on to cultural incapacity. So the second stage of the continuum is cultural incapacity, which is defined as the lack of responding effectively to the needs, interests, and preferences of culturally and linguistically diverse groups based on biases. So cultural incapacity is the lack of responding effectively to the needs, interests, and preferences of individuals based on culture, language, race, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, country of origin or nationality, or other groups based on extremely biased views towards those outside of a culture other than their own. A system or an agency does not intentionally seek out to be culturally destructive, but rather lacks the capacity to help minority clients or communities that they may be serving. This can look like not providing bilingual personnel when needed, disproportionate allocation of resources that may benefit one cultural group over another, subtle messages that some cultural groups are neither valued nor welcome, lower expectations for some cultural, ethnic, and racial groups. So again, what are some examples? And some examples that are that you can see on the screen are institutional and systemic bias and discrimination in hiring and promotion practices. What are some other examples that we can think of that would fall under cultural incapacity? So we've gotten a response. We're getting some responses via the chat function. So the first one is disregarding an applicant because of their name, and that's definitely discrimination that falls under cultural incapacity, especially when it comes to the hiring and promotion of people. Biases of medical professionals on treatment of certain populations in hospitals. That's another great example that we see often, especially when folks are coming in through the emergency room. And then we also have forms that do not allow someone to identify their gender as they see themselves. And that's another great example on our intake forms within our agency for us to be mindful of, being able to apply these skills that we're talking about, this continuum, to our agency. If there's an intake form that folks are filling out when they come in, do the forms allow for someone to identify their gender as they see themselves? So again, I think that we have a clear understanding of cultural incapacity. So let's move on to the third one, which is cultural blindness. So the third stage of the continuum is cultural blindness. It is important to note that this stage may be difficult to grasp for some people because most people believe that they are very culturally competent, but these individuals might instead be within this stage of the continuum and not know it. Cultural blindness is an expressed philosophy of viewing and treating all people as the same while ignoring differences. An example of cultural blindness is the equality versus equity debate. Equity is giving everyone what they need to be successful, while equality gives everyone the same thing regardless of what their need is. Equality aims to promote fairness, but it can only work if everyone starts from the same place and needs the same help. And some examples of cultural blindness would be a workforce that lacks diversity, approaches in delivery or services that ignore cultural strengths, and attitudes that blame consumers, individuals, or families for their circumstances. So, again, what are some examples that we can think of that really show cultural blindness? So we're getting some responses via the chat function. So one example is saying that a family should learn English since they're in the United States, right? So being blind to different cultures and making the assumption that just because someone lives in the United States, they should be speaking English where they're at. Another example of this that I think really helps to put it in perspective, I know for me, is when people say all lives matter, right? Being blind to the difference in diversity, right? So that's the essential example that I use for me to be able to understand this concept of cultural blindness. All lives matter. We have another response: treating all black people the same regardless of where they are from. For example, West Indian versus African Americans that are from the continent of Africa versus Haitian. Those are some great examples, and we're going to move forward into cultural pre-competence. The fourth stage of the continuum is cultural pre-competence. This is a level of awareness within systems or organizations of their strengths and areas for growth to respond effectively to culturally and linguistically diverse populations. So some of the examples that you can see that are listed there is the delivery of high-quality services and support to culturally and linguistically diverse populations, hiring practices that support a diverse workforce, addressing consumer complaints about culturally insensitive comments and services. So some examples on how we can apply this within our organization is having an organization that can make the agency more welcoming, thinking about the pictures that we have up around our office, the magazines that we have out, music that may be played if we're having a community event, or if you're having a community event at your agency, the music that's being played, does it reflect the culture of the community that's being served? This also includes the way we use signs that allow clients to choose which bathroom they want to use, regardless of their gender. So ensuring that we have gender-neutral bathrooms. Another example, when we're thinking about hiring practices that support a diverse workforce, would be having a diverse staff that reflects the diversity of the people that are being served by your organization. What are some other examples of cultural pre-competence that you can think of? Okay, we didn't get any responses through the chat function, and that's okay. I think that everyone has a good understanding based off the examples that I just said. So we're going to move on to cultural competence. The fifth stage of the continuum is cultural competence. Cultural competence is the demonstration of acceptance and respect for cultural differences. This is shown in an organization's ability to integrate principles of community engagement that results in the reciprocal transfer of knowledge and skills between all consumers, collaborators, partners, and key stakeholders. The following are examples. A mission statement that articulates principles and values for cultural and linguistic competence in all aspects of the organization. specific policies and procedures that integrate cultural and linguistic competence in each core function of the organization, the ability to identify, use, and/or adopt evidence-based practices that are competent, the maintenance of a diverse and culturally and linguistically competent workforce, and an ongoing education for yourself and others at your organization. Can anyone think of an example of how other ways that we can see cultural competence within our organizations? We're getting some responses via the chat function. So one response that we got is using gender-neutral language. And yes, that's a perfect example of cultural competence. Ensuring that we're using gender-neutral language until maybe we get a person's pronouns, and then we know which ones to use with them. So we're going to move forward into the last one on the continuum. So the last stage of the continuum, we got another one for cultural competence. So having cultural diversity within all levels of the agency, frontline, mid-management, higher administration, and board. Yes, I completely agree with that. I think that sometimes in organizations, they may have a culturally diverse frontline staff that really reflects the community, but as you look further into the organization, you're seeing that maybe the management, higher administration, and the board is not culturally diverse and does not really reflect the community that's being served. So I think that highlighting those different levels within an agency, so it's not just being culturally diverse on one certain level of staffing, but throughout the whole organization and including the board. It's a great point. Thank you. So moving into cultural proficiency. This is the last stage of the continuum. Cultural proficiency within a system or organization is the ability to hold culture in a high esteem while using it as a foundation to guide all their endeavors. Organizations seeking to add to the knowledge learned from cultural competency practice by conducting research, influencing approaches to care, and improving relationships with diverse groups. Some examples of how we can see that is to develop and disseminate health and mental health promotion materials that are adapted for specific cultural groups. For example, the CLEAR intervention was adopted to suit HIV-negative persons and having bilingual literature for agencies that serve those whose primary language is not English. Another example is actively pursuing resource development to meet the intended priority population. So an example of that could be differentiating the needs of all learners, right? So if you're going into the community and you're maybe doing a presentation, really holding that the idea that people do learn different ways and having different ways to present the information that your agency is presenting. Continually enhancing and expanding the organization's capacity and cultural and linguistic competence. And the last one is to advocate alongside and on behalf of populations who are traditionally underserved. And that's something that we can do with our populations that we work with. And the last one is to establish and maintain partnerships with diverse constituency groups, which span the boundaries of traditional mental health and health care, and eliminate racial and ethnic disparities in health and mental health. So what are some examples that we can think of where we can see cultural proficiency within our organizations or organizations that we work with? So some examples that we're getting via the chat function is having diversity training at your locations, being involved in diverse coalitions, including strategic or annual planning, I think having alliances with other groups and organizations other than your own definitely would fall into cultural proficiency. And another response is receiving capacity building and technical assistance. And I think that's definitely along the lines of cultural proficiency. It's this lifelong self-assessment and reflection that's happening, right? So when your organization or you as an individual is in this stage of the continuum, you're understanding that you're constantly learning new things about different cultures, and you don't know it all, and you won't be able to know it all, but you're constantly self-assessing and reflecting and learning. Those are some great examples. Thank you so much. And we got one more, providing literature and information to people of different cultures in ways that they understand. That's a great example of agency-wide. How can we ensure that across our agency we are being culturally proficient and providing services along those lines? So now we're going to transition to review quick tips that will guide your program and organization to assess where you and or your organization is on the continuum. We will also discuss how to create and implement culturally appropriate services to diverse populations as you move along the continuum. We will be reviewing 5 tips that may guide your organization's process of achieving a desired goal as it relates to the continuum. Please be aware that if any agency seeks a desired outcome, it must be a communal effort throughout the agency. So the 5 tips are easy to grasp, and they are the following: involvement evaluation, identification, development, and implementation. Let's take a look at tip number 1. Tip number 1 is involvement. As an agency, engage your staff to define the stages of the continuum with their own words to gauge understanding and attitudes. You may then divide your staff into 6 smaller groups if you're able to split them into 6 smaller groups. Just ideally divide your staff into groups and assign each of them a stage of the continuum. As a team, they can discuss their definitions and have them come up with a group of examples for their assigned stage of the continuum. This can lend itself to a larger discussion amongst the staff, and it would be helpful when we move into tip number 2. For example, one team may have been assigned cultural destructiveness. As a group, they could have concluded that the Dakota Access Pipeline crossing under the Missouri River and near Standing Rock Indian Reservation can be classified as cultural destructiveness because it poses a threat to clean water and dismantles ancient burial grounds. Let's take a look at tip number 2. So tip number 2 is evaluation. While building on the work done in tip number 1, the agency staff should be able to agree where the agency may fall on the continuum. This evaluation should consider internal and external factors and staff members' individual experiences within the agency to make these assessments applicable to their daily work. So some experiences to consider may include, but are definitely not limited to, their interactions with clients, interactions with community members, consumers, and fellow agencies. So again, as you're doing that evaluation, you want to split it into 2 parts. So doing an internal assessment, taking a look at your policies, your procedures, what are your screening questions, what does your intake look like, any kind of promotional materials that you're using. You also want to do an external assessment, right? So based on what you know and hear, where would the community place you on the continuum? And that might even look like you bringing a couple of clients in that you provide services to, or people from the community as well, and having a little focus group and having a candid discussion about the continuum and how are your services falling when it comes to that continuum. So that's tip number 2, evaluation. And then after completing that assessment, each team will brainstorm and identify needs for tip number 3. So tip number 3 was to identify, right? While identifying needs, one thing to be mindful of is equity across all organizational programs. For example, your testing center may be culturally proficient as it relates to Spanish-speaking Latino MSM, but may be cultural pre-competent when it relates to Black women. Please note that this may require some heavy digging because some changes might be apparent, while others might be less evident and obscure. So again, remember when we talked about the continuum, you can be different places on the continuum with different populations that you serve. So that's also something to be mindful of when you're going through and looking at these tips, especially this tip that we just talked about, which is to identify the needs that you need to fill, right? There are some potential questions that you may want to consider. 1, are employees skilled and trained to provide culturally appropriate services? 2, does marketing material from the agency meet the needs of your priority population? 3, Does the agency communicate in a manner that reflects cultural diversity? And 4, are there alternative hours or extended hours for communities that may have religious obligations during your agency's general business hours? The next tip after identifying needs is brainstorming solutions to respond to those needs. As an agency, you should collectively select the top 5 needs or priorities to reach your desired priority goal, your desired target goal on the continuum. So once you have outlined those top 5 priorities, then depending on what they are, you may need to develop internal processes as it comes to those, or foster an environment conducive to those policies, being consistent, being flexible, and always remaining open to suggestions. So some solutions can range from, like we just talked about, policies to staff training. The solutions will foster an environment that promotes growth, self-reflection, and assessment, and effective service delivery. So an example is an agency with a priority population of young men who have sex with men. Might only train staff members that identify as YMSM to do testing. However, training all staff members to test may result in the removal of other barriers that may prevent clients from being tested. Tip number 5, the implementation of solutions is a key component to achieving your agency and programmatic goals. As mentioned previously, training may be part of the solution. Do not hesitate to seek and provide the necessary training, education, and professional development needed to climb the continuum. There is no end to the continuum. Therefore, it requires an ongoing process of engaging with the evolving field. Organizations that practice consistency, flexibility, and open-door policies are better positioned to adjust to changes. We, Hands United, are available to provide trainings for your organizations. We will discuss in detail how to request trainings and coachings in the next slides ahead. And it doesn't always have to be capacity building, but those are some trainings that we have available and we'll talk about. But also thinking about continuing education credits, going to ongoing professional development, whether it be conferences or different workshops that are being had, maybe by other organizations in the area that you or your staff could benefit from. So let's review, as we come to an end, let's review some of the content that we covered today. We wanted to review what was learned today. As discussed, there are 6 stages of the cultural competence continuum: cultural destructiveness, cultural incapacity, cultural blindness, cultural pre-competence, cultural competence, and cultural proficiency. There are also 5 tips that could be used to help you, the provider, to create and implement culturally appropriate services to diverse populations. Those include involvement, evaluation, identification, development, and implementation. So at this point, we're really winding down to the end. Are there any questions or comments before we kind of move into ways in which you can move forward and request capacity building assistance or training if you are interested in that? Okay, so just some information on who we are. As I said, we are Hands United. We are the Capacity Building Service program at the Latino Commission on AIDS. So we provide services under these three main provisions that are shown up here on your screen. So we provide trainings and assistance around high-impact testing. So some examples of trainings that we do under this provision are stigma mapping, targeted testing and recruitment, social marketing, and social network strategy. We also provide capacity building services under prevention with persons living with HIV. Some of the trainings that we provide, some of our more popular trainings that we provide under this provision are cultural humility, addressing stigma, linkage and re-engagement to care, and then CLEAR. And the final provision that we provide services on is organizational management and development. And some of our more popular services under that are understanding and managing burnout, strategic planning, board development, and grant writing. It looks like we have a question. Do you only provide capacity building for agencies that are funded through the CDC or SAMHSA, or can you provide CBA to agencies regardless of your funding source? So we can provide services to agencies regardless of their funding source. It's just a little bit easier to put in your request for a training if you're CDC funded. But if you're not CDC funded, in 2 slides over, we'll talk specifically about how you can request a training. And then at the bottom of the screen here, we just shows our specific values as a program, and they are sex positivity, multiculturalism, innovation, critical thinking, and health equity. And just to give you a little bit of background information on the Latino Commission on AIDS, we're a not-for-profit organization that was founded in 1990. And we have provided services all over the U.S., including Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And we have 5 core areas that we provide services on as a whole organization. They are the Hispanic Behavioral Research Center, HIV Prevention and Health Promotion, the Capacity Building Assistance Program, which we talked about, Hands United, falls under that program. HIV testing and access to care, so we do HIV testing, access to care, and linkage to care, specifically in New York City, where our offices are located. And then we also do some health policy and community mobilization work. So, how you can request trainings, capacity building assistance, and any kind of coaching sessions that you may be interested in. If you are CDC directly funded, then that means that you have access to the CRIS system, so you can go to the website that is linked there that I just clicked under. You can go to that website and put in a request for any training that you feel that your agency may need. Not even specific to what we talked about today, cultural competence, but any kind of services that you feel like your organization may need help with, you can apply for those services there. For organizations that are not directly funded, you can contact your local health department, and they will be able to submit a request in that same CRIS system on your behalf. So all requests for trainings must be put into the system. So if you are not funded by the CDC or SAMHSA, you can have your local health department put in a request on your behalf, and it will get triaged. It goes to the same organization. So the same organizations that provide capacity building assistance for the CDC directly funded organizations are the same organizations that will provide services for those who are not directly CDC funded. And all of these trainings and services and capacity building assistance are free of charge through the CRIS system. So it's definitely something to take advantage of if you identify a need within your agency, because that help is free and available to you. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for attending this webinar. We have a couple more that we will be having later on this month. So if you are interested in that, you can reach out. And so there's an email on the screen. It says cbadivision@latinoaids.org. If you would like some information on the upcoming webinars that we have scheduled, you can send an email there, and I can get back to you with the registration information. If you want any assistance putting in a request, again, that would be an email that you can reach out to if you are looking for a training or any of our services. You can shoot an email to cbadivision@latinoaids.org, and someone will get back to you within a day or so about that. Especially if you need assistance with putting in a request, please don't hesitate to reach out to that email. So we have a question about troubleshooting, registering for the upcoming webinars. Again, if you can send an email to cbadivision@latinoaids.org, we will be able to get you all set and registered for those upcoming webinars next week and the week after. Thank you so much again for participating in our webinar. When you log out, there will be a quick evaluation. Please complete it. Let us know what you thought of the webinar, and we hope to see you on our webinars next week and the week after. Thank you so much. And on the screen now, I'll leave it up for another minute or so. These are the references that were used throughout, so the information presented throughout the webinar. These are the references for those. We're getting a question, will the slides be made available? We can send them out after we close out. We can send